Hi, it's Marla at Narrate. In this week's message, Adam asks the question, have you ever said yes to something or someone and later learned what you thought you said yes to and what you actually said yes to were two different things? Can Mary's life help us as we deal with our unmet expectations? Enjoy the second message in the Mother Mary series.
So, have you ever said yes to something and then days, weeks, sometimes years later, you realize that that thing that you thought you said yes to and that thing you actually said yes to are two completely different things? You with me? It's a little bit of a complicated question, but I think it sets the tone for where we're going. Like, can you relate to the emotion, the disappointment, the frustration, the angst of saying yes to something and then later going, wait a minute? That's not at all the way this is supposed to go. Like, it happens when we get online and order a shirt from Amazon, right? Have you ever had this happen where a shirt shows up and you're like, that's not blue. It's clearly green. And the great thing about Amazon is that you say, like, not as described, and it costs you not a nickel, just a little bit of your time because you send it back. Or at a restaurant, ever ordered something at a restaurant? And it shows up and you're like, wait a minute. This isn't what I asked for. I was thinking about that this week, and several years ago I went to lunch downtown with a 50-something friend who's very sarcastic and brazen, and we went to this restaurant, and I don't even know why I tried, because I hate chicken pot pie. I don't know those of you that like chicken pot pie. I just think it's soggy and disgusting, but the special that day was chicken pot pie, and so for whatever reason, in this kind of spontaneous moment that I don't have all that often, or at least not over chicken pot pie, I was like, we both tried to order the chicken pot pie, and the waitress was like, sorry, there's only one chicken pot pie left, and I was like, sweet, great, because I don't even know what I was thinking. He can have the chicken pot pie. And then a little bit later, of course, the meal came out. This is a sit-down kind of place, and it was a gravy boat. So it was like a porcelain glass, or what, it was a bowl. I think it was a gravy boat full of what would generally be the contents of said chicken pot pie, but there was no pie. I mean, it was just this bowl of nastiness, and then there were two bread stars floating on the surface. So you can kind of see what they're doing there, right? And so a little bit later, the waitress came by, and they're like, hey, so how do you like the chicken pot pie? And he goes, I wouldn't exactly call it chicken pot pie. She's like, why? And he said, because there's no pie. She's like, well, we've got those little bread star things. He goes, yeah, I see what you're trying to do. It's not a chicken pot pie. You ever had that experience at a restaurant where you're like, this is not what I had in mind? I remember years ago, Teresa and I, when we were in that season where we didn't have the luxury of going out to eat to super nice restaurants, and it must have been an anniversary or something. We went to this restaurant in Billings, and I ordered, I'm always looking for the seafood pasta. I'm not a steak guy. I'm not a chicken press guy at the restaurant. I'm like, I might as well have something I'm not going to have at home. And so I ordered the seafood pasta, and she was like, well, it comes with prawns. And I was like, what's a prawn? She said, it's a big shrimp. Sweet, I'm in. And then it showed up, and it was these nasty, like, giant shrimp, like eyeballs, antenna, legs, and it was just, that disappointing moment of like, oh, this is not at all what I had in mind. Or have you ever had that with a person? Like, have you ever said yes to a person? And sometimes it's funny and trivial, and sometimes we're cutting at some of the most painful stuff in life. Ever said yes to a person? And then days, weeks, months, years later realized, wait a minute. I hired you, and quite frankly, I think your mom filled out your application. You're nothing like the person I hired. Or it can work the other way. Ever taken a job and they wooed you and they convinced you that there was a certain culture and that the boss behaves a certain way, and then a few months later you're like, no, you're nothing like the way you presented yourself. Ever had a roommate? Ever had a mentor or been in some kind of classroom? Have you ever joined a team under the guise that this person is like this, and then later you realize they're nothing like that? Ever been in a marriage like that? I mean, now we are getting into some of the pain, aren't we? In fact, some of you, your friends don't understand why you're divorced, but you do, and it's because what they said they were, who they said they were, you had the unfortunate opportunity to experience that they're not that. And that leads to lots of pain. Some of you, it's led to your divorce. Some of you, it's leading towards one. And even if it's not leading towards one, if we're being honest, it's what makes marriage awesome and yet at the same time incredibly difficult, isn't it? Because I don't care how thorough you are. There's just frankly no way of fully knowing a person and the way they present themselves in that kind of courting realm until you share a roof, is there? And years of time and experience and checkbooks and things like that. When Teresa and I were dating, in hindsight, we were kids. Is it a sign that you're getting old when you go to a wedding and you feel yourself being judgmental because they're so young? And then you're like, uh-oh, I think I was younger. I've had that experience recently. But So when we were dating, she grew up with like a lumberjack dad, and they like to play outside and do stuff outside, and me not so much. And so when we were dating, though, we went cross-country skiing, and we went hiking, and we did those kinds of things that I now take for granted living in Helena. But it wasn't necessarily a way of life for everyone in Billings, and it wasn't my way of life. And then we got married, and it was like suddenly I didn't like that stuff anymore. In fact, on our honeymoon, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, I didn't even have a category for anxiety, but I can see now, we went on this big hike in Rocky Mountain National Forest, and I had this massive anxiety attack. I didn't know it at the time, and I didn't necessarily like fall on the ground, but there was this like very uncomfortable day, and that wasn't very much fun. And then we would try to go hiking other times, and I had these horrible experiences. And then she tried to take me skiing one time, and it always ended up in a fight or something. And so about a year in, we reached this point where like, I don't like to go outside. Your family's crazy. What's wrong with the TV, for crying out loud? That was kind of the dynamic of our marriage. And we had what I think in hindsight was one of the best gifts I've ever been given. It's the number one advice I give to couples when they care to hear mine as they're headed towards marriage. And that was, there was a couple who offered to have dinner with us once a month for the first 2 years. And again, the design of that was just this, that we don't care how hard you've worked in your type A-ness on your premarital. The reality is you're going to learn things about each other that cause you to kind of not connect, and so we need a place to talk that through. And Teresa was sharing with Fred this like, we don't do anything together anymore. We don't share any interests. Some of you may have had the same conversation. It's hilarious how opposites always attract. And I remember Fred looking at me, getting really firm, kind of fatherly style, and said, Adam, I got to be honest with you. I think being one thing while you're dating and then becoming another once you're married, like, I think that's deceptive and borderline evil. And it jolted me. And we've spent the last 17 years, 18 years working on, since that first difficult year or two, working on taking an interest in each other's lives. And so we do backpack now. But we do it for completely different reasons. Let's be clear on that. My wife likes to backpack because she likes to sleep with bears, eat crummy food, do all kinds of, sleep on rocks. Like that's why she likes to backpack. I like to backpack because I love the feeling of packing up and headed for the car. Like, it's the best part of backpacking is getting back to the car, in my opinion. She likes to ski because she likes to be cold and risk her life on high chairlifts. I like to ski because I have 3 boys, and I'm just a better parent if we're outside together. So we have these completely different values, but we've learned to kind of get along in that. Have you ever said yes? We can up the ante one more time. Have you ever said yes to God? And then weeks, months, years later, you realize that he received your yes, but he didn't necessarily tell you that you were saying yes to something different than you understood at the time. Maybe for some of you, this is your spiritual crisis. This is why you haven't been here for a long time. It's why she goes, but you don't, or he goes, but you don't. Because there's this thing that happens where our youth pastor, or when we were younger, or our kids pastor, or whatever, maybe not, we weren't younger, maybe we started coming to church at 30 and we connected with God and we said yes to God, and we didn't realize at the time, but we had these very clear promises laid out for us, and then as the years unfolded, we saw that like none of that stuff was occurring the way God said that it would. Ever had that experience with God? See, here's what I want to jump into this morning is, I said last week that I think the Catholics have got a lot of things right, and that's not to objectify them. I have lots of friends who identify best through Catholicism, but I think they've got a lot of things very right about Mary. That's not to say that I'm interested in praying to her. I'm not interested in those nuanced theologies, but the attention and adoration they have for her as a person, I think is well-founded. And what I've experienced in the last 10 years, quite frankly, really since experiencing this whole church plant together, is that Mary has a lot to offer us as we try to reconcile, God, I said yes to this, but I got this. And I don't know how to grieve that. I don't know how to accept that. I don't know what to do with that. Mary, I think, can help us there to a very high degree. So last week we talked about her astounding yes, that as a 13-year-old girl, she has this invitation to give birth to the Messiah that would have come with all kinds of social and physical risks to her family, to her fiance, to just her town of Nazareth. She said yes, and we just kind of marveled at the makeup of a woman who said that, who said, yeah. This week I want to look at it as Mary as, for me, the quintessential object lesson of what do we do when upon reflection we said yes, but what we meant and what God meant were two completely different things. So last week we left off the story with Gabriel leaving wherever Gabriel came and met Mary. Remember we talked about if you were to paint it or draw it, you wouldn't even know where, because we're not given the context of where this moment happened between her and Gabriel. We just know that she said, I am the Lord's servant, may it be as you have said, and boom, Gabriel left. Now, in Luke's account, he doesn't tell us that after that she went and talked to Joseph. He doesn't tell us that after that she went and talked to her parents. In fact, there's a lot of silence about what did she do in those moments, minutes, maybe even hours and days immediately following this interaction. In fact, the next detail Luke gives us about Mary is that she ran off to go meet with her elder relative Elizabeth, who was herself pregnant under some pretty miraculous circumstances. And as soon as she arrived at Elizabeth's house, Elizabeth broke out into this kind of prophetic song. And then, when Elizabeth was done, Mary broke out into her own song. If you were raised in a liturgical Catholic environment, you may know it as the Magnificat. And you've always wondered, like, what's this cat? Because it doesn't show up in the Bible. Who is this? What is this thing? It's this song. It's called the Magnificat because in Latin, which of course became the dominant language of the Western Church after that schism, in Latin, the first word in this song is Magnificat. It's actually the English word glorious. What I want to do is look at this song because I think it's a rendition of, okay, when I said I'd marry you, I understood that I was getting this. And 15 years later, I'm getting this. And how do I reconcile that? Not just be bitter about it. How do I deal with that? When I said yes to you, God, I understood this. And now I'm going, but wait a minute. I think you're still God, but I've got this. Mary, I think, is an example. Let's jump in. Verse 46, and Mary said, my soul glorifies the Lord. So there's that word Magnificat. My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. So why is Mary so excited? Well, let's just remember what Gabriel promised her. Go back to verse 32. In verse 32, he is Jesus, he will be great. This is Gabriel promising Mary, this is what this son will do. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. Now, let's be clear on this. What Mary understood the invitation to involve was like giving birth to the next Davidic king of Israel, the long-awaited Davidic king of Israel, who would set up a Davidic throne in Jerusalem and kick the Romans and Herod out of town, and that king would sit on a throne, and she gets to be his mom. And add to that, the promise was that son would have a son, who would have a son, who would have a son, who would have a son. She would be the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of the king of Israel. That was the promise. That's what she was told. And she had every reason to believe that's what was to come about, because that's what Gabriel said to her. She's excited because she gets to give birth to the Davidic king of Israel in a physical kind of way. So why is she glorifying? Well, listen to this. For he has been mindful, he being God now, of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed. For the mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is his name. What is going on here? Well, she recognizes that she has been pulled from the very bottom of culture and society. That she's a nobody from Nazareth whose parents were perpetual, like, miners. They were tectons. They were stonemasons. She didn't come from a high intelligentsia. She didn't come from income. She didn't come from art. She was just a working class daughter. And what she recognizes is God is taking her from nowhere and giving her this incredibly prominent role. His mercy, she says, his mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. Ever wonder if God actually notices your faithfulness? You know that feeling of like, wait a minute, my shipping would be free if I just clicked this little button and I'd be lying, but it'd be free. Does God even care if I live my life pointed towards the fear of God? Mary has this affirming moment where she goes, God was paying attention. And those moments where I was struggling to be faithful and all my friends were doing this and I wasn't doing that, God noticed. He plucked me out of all of civilization because he saw how deeply I cared for him. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who were proud in the inmost thoughts. In the 1980s, this song was banned by the government of Guatemala from being said publicly. Why? Well, this last thing hints at it, and she gets into it from here. Watch what happens. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. Who are the rulers? Scholars will say, almost 201, that there's anybody who heard this would have thought of Herod. If you were alive with Mary, you would have thought of Caesar. You would have thought of Rome. You would have thought of all the soldiers. You'd have thought of the fact that you were an occupied country. And the promise is that's all going to come to an end because of who? Because of the son that I'm going to give birth to, not me, her. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. Again, this isn't a commentary against affluence so much as it's a commentary against people who sold out. Remember, there was a whole group of religious people in Jesus' day who had lots of money and lots of power because they agreed to stay out of Rome's way. The most general term is the Sadducees, but there's a whole class of people. The Pharisees had their own kind of moments where they got out of Rome's way. And what she's saying is, listen. The benefits of this son are going to come from those who have nothing. And those who are already fat and happy, so to speak, it's not going to go well for them. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful. Go on to 55 too, Bridget. To Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors. Again, what's happening here? Well, what's happening is Mary's calling out Herod. Remember, Herod was the king of Israel. That was his claim. I am the king of Israel. She's going, no, you're not. You're not the real king of Israel. God is still going to stay faithful to his promises to Israel, and you're not them. So what's the point here? Well, she's quite clear on what she said yes to. Okay, so if I take that, I'll be recognized as the best teacher ever, and I'll be celebrated for my intelligence, and I'll be rewarded for my income. I'll make the cover of magazines. She's doing what we do, where we say yes, but we have these unspoken expectations for where that's going to lead. Mary was told by Gabriel this is what was going to happen. For that matter, she would eventually learn that Joseph was told the same thing from Gabriel. Joseph was also told that this was going to happen. For that matter, she's meeting with Elizabeth. Pretty soon, Elizabeth's going to tell her that her husband, Zechariah, had an experience with Gabriel, who was told by God this is the way it's going to go. And if that's not confusing enough, eventually there's going to be a birth, and some shepherds are going to show up, and they're going to go, hey, these angels appeared, and they told us this kid is the king of Israel. Mary has every reason to believe this. Well, so from here, what happens within the story is kind of the typical Christmas stuff, right? It's the stuff that lawn ornaments are made of. There's a trek south to Bethlehem. There's a birth under these very dire circumstances. There's stars and magi and all these things that occur. But the thing that we often blow past is the fact that there was actually these three little ceremonies that they participated in. The three ceremonies that devout Jews would have participated in. One happened on the 8th day after Jesus' birth. The next on the 40th, or the other two. It's the circumcision, where they give them a lollipop or put some sugar on their lips, and then they do the unspeakable. And then, you guys are tough. I thought that was funny. Come on. And then there's the purification of the bride, of the mother. And then there's the consecration of the son, especially if he's the firstborn son. Now, Leviticus, just to make us all uncomfortable, the background of all this is Leviticus 12. And I think it's important to spend a few moments, because what happens in these three ceremonies in Mary's life, I think, is right at the center of what's important to understand about her, but we skip over it in our Christmas pageants because we want to get to the big kind of festive stuff. So Leviticus 12, here's the background of these three ceremonies. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will become ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. Verse 3, on the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Lots of offensive, very uncomfortable stuff here. Let me just try to spend a second here. Remember, anytime we're reading the ancient text and we're making judgments about the justice of God in that text, we are making a very important strategic decision, because we have two options. We compare the treatment, say in this case, of mothers to the way they're treated today. That's one option. And from that, it looks barbaric, uncivilized, horrific. Or we compare the treatment of mothers in this text to the way other cultures treated mothers in the same day. We always have to make that choice when reading about things like slavery and the treatment of people, any of the kind of assumed injustices that go, wait a minute, how did God not just interrupt that and go, this isn't right? We have a decision to make there. And if you go with we're going to compare the standards then to the standards then, the Bible is compared to other cultural standards, then what scholar after scholar after scholar will point out is that on that level, the Bible was progressive. That its treatment of women far surpassed most, if not all, other cultures. So, also consider this. Women were objects. Husbands owned their wives. What if part of what's happening here is going, well, we can't necessarily count on the men to respect and give boundaries to this new mother. But if we scare the hell out of them, we can help. Literally. Like if we make it a function of religion and say she's unclean, then that husband might not give her some space for recovery because he cares for her, but out of his own kind of twisted fear of God, perhaps he will. You see how so I realize that we're doing some semantics things, but the logic of that, we have to work that out. Nonetheless, what happens is on the 8th day, what we're told about Jesus and Mary, or Joseph and Mary, is that they took Jesus on the 8th day. He was circumcised, he was given his name, and then somewhere after the 40th day, they returned. And if you thought the first 8 were offensive, watch this. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. Again, that can be incredibly offensive, and I get that. It can also be this awesome way that God protected women, even though the culture didn't necessarily. Nonetheless, what happens after 40 days, Mary and Joseph make their way to Jerusalem. Now, we're told that along the way, we don't know actually when they picked up this turtle doves, but when they got there, because they're there for the consecration of the firstborn Jesus and the purification of the mother, just like we read about in Leviticus 12, there's an offering that's supposed to be offered. The text says it's supposed to be a lamb. They offer 2 turtle doves, which is a flying turtle. But what they're actually told is that the text says that if you can't afford a lamb, you can provide 2 turtle doves, which is telling and confirming, that their economic, social condition was what it's been portrayed as, that they could only afford turtle doves. And in fact, one female biblical scholar said it this way. I love the way she said this. She said, one of the riddles with which Mary must wrestle is that of the exalted promises concerning her child and the impoverished circumstances attendant to the birth. So Mary's already kind of going, I don't know how this thing works. And I don't know how bad this is going to be a social disaster for me. And I don't know how long my dad's going to disown me. But eventually this baby becomes the king and my name becomes vindicated. And they walk into the temple and they offer the turtle doves. And somewhere in the timing of that, lightning strikes. And a man named Simeon takes Jesus out of Mary's arms. And this, to me, is one of those stories that I, and I think many of us, so easily miss about Christmas that seems to be right at the center of the actual story. Simeon takes Jesus out of Mary's arms. And he says this, the text says this in verse 28 of chapter 2 of Luke. Simeon took him in the arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. So this man apparently has lived this last season at least of his life believing that he would see the Messiah before he died. He goes on to say, for my eyes have seen your salvation. Again, so he's getting what's going on here. This baby is not just another baby. This is the Davidic king of Israel. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles. And there's a hint, there's a clue, and the glory of your people Israel. Even in this prophetic utterance, there's this warning that Jesus isn't here to play favorites, and he's not here to play religion, and he's not here to play social club, that the Gentiles God has in mind. Why are we doing the Backyard Initiative on Christmas Eve? There's a sense of like, couldn't this lead to this huge budget shortfall before the year's over? Yep. Why do we scatter all the time? Why do we do that? Because God consistently has this eye towards people who are on the outside. And it's not a bait and a switch. If people come to know God because of the way we serve them, great. But we have to recognize that God has always, go back and read the Exodus stories. You see that even with the plagues with Pharaoh, God was keenly aware of the Egyptians and was trying to rescue them too in the midst of all of that. That's why we scatter, because this God cares deeply for people who don't necessarily fly his flag. And then Simeon keeps going. Well, first of all, the mom and the dad, they have this like, shucks, we get to give, they have this very proud moment, like where they're kind of hitting, it's not me. I mean, he's just amazing. It's not me, it's her, those kinds of things. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. So they had their proud moment. And then Simeon, it says, verse 34, then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother. So he turns to Mary. And part of what I want you to ask yourself as we read this is, why do we know that this was said? He turns to Mary. This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel and to be a sign that will be spoken against. So the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. Now let's stop there. This isn't new information for Mary, right? Like, yeah, I know, I get that. This is bad news for Herod. This is bad news for Caesar. This is bad news for people who don't necessarily care about God. Like, there's this kind of thing that's happening, this revolution. See, what we're dealing with here is a 2.0 version of Mary, that she's not soft and gentle. Well, she might have been gentle, but she wasn't weak. She was a tenacious, revolutionary woman who was excited about the fact that she's giving birth to that guy. And then listen to what Simeon says to her last, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Question, how do we know that that was said to Mary? How do we know? And could we not say that really the most rational explanation for that is Mary didn't forget that it was said to her? Something about those words and that moment stuck with her. Like upon reflection, oh yeah, there was this thing Simeon said way back then. Could it be that this is the first moment upon reflection where Mary goes, wait a minute. I mean, I'm frustrated and I'm mad, but I was given clues. There were hints. God hinted to me that this isn't necessarily going to go the way you think. Could this be that this was the first instance where Mary became aware of the fact that her vision of what her life was going to look like and God's vision of what her life were going to look like were two completely different things? Could this be that this is the first instance where Mary has this moment where she goes, wait a minute. Simeon said this thing, and I didn't understand it, but I wasn't able to forget it. And now that I'm standing at this wedding in Canaan, and I'm just convinced Jesus needs to start being the Messiah, for crying out loud. Do what you're supposed to do. And she's grieving the fact that he won't turn the water into wine, and she won't follow his program. Is this where she starts going, but wait a minute, there was this moment where God said that this sword would pierce my soul. Could it be that this is the first instance where Mary begins to grieve the fact that her visions for the Messiah and his visions for the Messiah were two completely different things? And see, if all that's true, this is why I say that Mary becomes one of my very favorite characters in the Bible, especially as a type A control freak. Because what Mary starts to expose is the humanness of the story. Call her what you want, Mother Mary, Saint Mary, the Blessed Mother. I don't really care. What I love about her story is it's so unpolished. If the gospel writers were trying to create this fictionalized account of Mary, they wouldn't have had her sticking her foot in her mouth as often as she did. The grief, the process of letting her dreams die as she takes up God's dreams is very evident in the little bits of pieces of her story that we get. Like when Jesus was 12 and he was at the temple and he completely behaved outside of what she thought he was supposed to do. And they had this tense moment. There's this one moment at this wedding in Canaan, where what I've alluded to already, where she's like, come on, get this show on the road. And Jesus turns and looks at her and he says, woman, like, park it, slow down. Your vision, my vision, they're different things. There's another moment where the guys, they come knocking at the door and they like, hey, your mom and brothers are out there. And Jesus is like, my mom and brothers, my real mom and brothers are those who are following me. Like Mary is not a dignified, polished story of somebody who's just like, okay, and then I just keep kind of going with God's flow. She's this very vibrant, dimensional, real-life picture of the real grief that has to happen as one's own vision for one's life is loosened and God's is accepted. It took her, it seems to me, 33 years to reconcile that what she said yes to and what she actually said yes to were different things. See, what if part of the invitation of Mary's story is that she invites us to live within that narrative? You know, there's all this conversation today about resiliency and the lack of it, and especially our kids and in our culture. And I was just talking with a friend the other day, like I feel bad for our kids, because the perception is that if you're not like peppy and happy, you're doing something wrong, right? The perception is that you can buy your way to certain levels of happiness, that if you just had the iPhone X, like you wouldn't need anything else. And the real story is life is filled with disappointments and you often have to adapt. And yeah, I'm preaching to myself on this one. But Mary seems to live that out, doesn't she? That in the midst of all the grief and all the turmoil and all the resentment and all the angst, we see a woman transitioning from going like, God, but you said. Even the shepherd said that you said. And her accepting like, oh yeah, but who gets to be the God of my story? Who's the boss? There's this very real grief. See, part of my hope for this weekend is that it would like spark your worship, because I'm guessing many of you have stories. You can look back and you can see these moments where you've had to grieve that it didn't go your way, but you have enough hindsight to go, thank you, God. I mean, you thought it was the end of the world when you lost that job. You thought it was the end of the world when that person wouldn't go to prom with you. And now you like see them at the reunion, and you're like, thank you, God, that you didn't answer that prayer. Right? You have the perspective. Maybe part of the Christmas season for you is getting inside of Mary's story and worshiping the fact that this God leads. And as you look at the next disappointment, the next moment where it's just not going the way, and you're trying to figure out, is this the point where I'm supposed to be tenacious and that's the right character? Or is this the point where I'm supposed to surrender and that's the right character? That you just reflect upon past experiences of this. And some of you, I'm guessing, are in it now. And on the one hand, I guess I just want to point out Mary's humanness. Go read a couple of the Gospels. The snippets that we get of her would seem to indicate that God doesn't need us to put a happy face on the grief. Mary's disdain at times was palpable. And it's a reminder that in the Bible, righteousness and faith, it's not an intellectual concept, it's a relational concept. It's a hesed love concept. It's the belief that like God is faithful, and I can't always understand it, and I can't always articulate it, and when I try to explain it, that's why C.S. Lewis stopped doing nonfiction, because he said, well, as soon as you try to like put it down in prose, it doesn't work. But when I put it into my story, that's why he started writing stories. It suddenly makes more sense. Maybe for you, it's an invitation to just step inside of this. You know, I went through this, we talked about this years ago, that as a 21-year-old, I was a part of a church plant that went from 200 people to 1,000 people in less than a year. And then I watched one of my better friends 5 years later go plant a church in Bozeman, and it went from 100 people to about 1,500 people in less than a year. And then we all moved to Helena, and it went from 80 people to 150 people to 180 people in 2 years. And there was this like, Lord, not quite what we signed up for. And yet I say that, and I can say upon reflection, wouldn't trade it for anything. In fact, I had my sword moment. When all that was happening, I remembered Fred, my mentor at the time. He had said, Adam, here's how I think this is going to go. I think for the first 2 years, people are going to wonder, you're going to wonder whether or not this was even supposed to happen. And then after 2 years, I think things will start rolling. And that's exactly what we've seen. And that's not to say it's all about numbers. It certainly isn't. But you have those stories from your life. Those reminders that getting your way is oftentimes a terrible strategy for connecting with God. Maybe Mary this season is an opportunity to step in and go, okay, Lord, this isn't going to be easy, but let the grief begin. It's a reminder of this question that we ended with. Can we go to that last question, Bridget? Thanks. What if the life of faith means trusting we're being led to a place we do not know, on a journey we do not control? And what if that's not just like a superficial kind of Saturday Night Live kind of warm and fuzzy statement? What if that's the life of faith as depicted in the life of Mary? Jesus, thanks. Thanks, Lord, that you know what it is to be human. You know what it is to be wrong. You know what it is to have, at times, manipulative, ambitious ideas. God, you know what it is to grieve the death of a dream. And God, I pray for people who are grieving the loss of a marriage or of their health, or that the fact that their business isn't as wildly successful, or at least in the way that they pictured, or that they don't have this national or international notoriety in their field. God, I pray that as we grieve things, that would compel us to draw closer to you. And thanks, God, that righteousness and trust, that those are terms of fidelity. Those are terms of trusting you, not having these robust, airtight explanations. We love you, Jesus.
If you
would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.